Hello and good day. This is the Bible Bard. A bard is a storyteller who recites traditional texts, often in the past associated with a particular oral tradition. But I'm here to recite and to amplify what the literature of the Bible says about who is God and who are human beings. Here's the place we're at today. In the early 16th century, that's the 1500s, to the 19th century, that's the 1800s, various church groups attempted to missionize the Native American Indians of Canada, the United States, and Central and South America. The motivating force for many of these religious efforts was a historical error in Christian understanding of a Bible story. In 2 Kings 17, verse 6, the text summarizes the story of the deportation of the 10 northern tribes called the Kingdom of Israel from their land to the Assyrian Empire. And it says, quote, in the 9th year of Hosea, that's 722 BCE, the king of Assyria, that's Shalmaneser II, took Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and carried Israel away unto Assyria and placed them in Hala and in Harbor on the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes, end quote. Comment, the places mentioned are in what is now Iraq and Iran. According to religious tradition, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were part of the northern kingdom of Israel, and that were conquered and then deported from that land by the Assyrians and resettled within the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BCE. Since historical records seem to stop mentioning this group by name, their subsequent fate in their dispersion became a late medieval mystery. The story of the 10 lost tribes happened to be a popular story among European Christians during the time that indigenous peoples, the Native Americans of North and South America, who are discovered, and the religious people in Europe thought, oh my, we've discovered the descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The mystery of where those tribes went seems to be solved. Comment, one of the many sources for this theory is that the Indians were Jews in America, are probabilities that the Americans are by race, by Thomas Thorogood. He's the fellow who wrote that story, probabilities that the Americans are by race. Another source is a friar and the Maya Diego de Landa and the account of things of Yucatan by a guy named Matthew Restall and others. Why would it matter whether the American Indians were Jews from the 10 tribes exiled from the land of Israel and deported and resettled in northern Mesopotamia? The European Christians produced two vastly different responses to this story that was popular in Europe. The first one was, if the American Indians are Jews that God punished for their idolatry by deporting them from the promised land, then they are under God's curse, and it's permissible to enslave them, kill them, or rob them. And that's what they did. Second idea of European Christians was, if the indigenous peoples of America were the Jews, the 10 lost tribes who had drifted to America after their deportation to Assyria, and they were to come and accept their punishment and turn to Christ, becoming Christians, then Jesus Christ would return to the earth from heaven and begin his 1,000-year kingdom on earth. And so it seemed to them, in this second view, that these Indians were the key to the return of Christ to earth from heaven. Now, these two responses to the idea that the American Indians were Jews from the 10 lost tribes are very different for the following reasons. The first theory provided a justification for European political and military powers to ravage the Indians searching for gold and other riches that they might have. The initial context between European explorers like Christopher Columbus and conquistadors like Cortez and the Indians brought diseases like smallpox to the native populations who were totally unprepared for this. So places like the Aztec capital in what is now Mexico City, 90% of the populations died, the native Indian populations, when they encountered these conquistadors. They didn't die because they were killed by the sword. They died because of the diseases in the blood of these conquistadors. When the Europeans, though, saw this devastation, some attributed it to God's curse that they thought had fallen on the Indians for their Jewish unbelief and paganism. However, the theory that the Indians were Jews of the 10 lost tribes led other Europeans to various missionization efforts from Christian denominations who thought if the Indians or the Jews were converted, the missionizers would bring Christ back from heaven. This great idea was extra biblical. There's nowhere in the text to support that. Nevertheless, since the common European did not read or own a Bible, this idea that the American Indians were Jews in the lost 10 tribes seemed to them to make sense. Discussion. The Bible Bard looks to the text of the Bible for information about who God is and what he wants, and who human beings are both to God and to others. Remember, the Bible is two things. It is a holy book when it reveals things about God that we could not otherwise know. And it is literature when it tells the story of humanity. As time passed and evidence accumulated, the more was learned about the indigenous cultures of America. The idea that these people were Jews from the lost 10 tribes lost credibility. And with the rise of archaeology and the expansion of history about the same time, the empires and practices of the Middle East were uncovered, and we know that the 10 lost tribes were never lost. In fact, by order of Cyrus II the Great, at about 539 BCE, the Assyrian Jews returned to their homeland, and later Darius I, about 520 to 519 BCE, allowed them to rebuild their religious temple in their past native land. Comment, you can see the books of the Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah, for a contemporary written history of those events. What the Bible Bard can say about these missionization efforts was that most of them were contemptible. The Catholic missions of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits in Canada, the U.S., and Paraguay, and the Order of the Friars Minor, the Franciscans in Mexico and California, Peru, Bolivia, the Order of the Preachers, the Dominicans in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, and the Order of St. Augustine in Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, used methods of missionization that included violence, enslavement, resettlement, and the imposition of European cultural practices as if these practices were a required aspect for Christian conversion. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, the SPG by the Church of England, wasn't much better in their work among indigenous peoples of the British colonies. The Moravian Church, Unitas Frantem, missionized in the eastern United States and in Greenland, the Caribbean, among the Lenape, Delaware, and Mohican tribes. The Company for the propagation of the gospel in New England by the Puritans had a mixed message, sometimes treating the indigenous people with respect, like the Puritan John Eliot, who translated the Bible into the Algonquin language, and sometimes others acting as missionaries who saw the Indians as savages to exploit and even convert by force. Comment, see The Life of John Eliot by Nehemiah Adams, 1847, especially chapters 3 and 5, and also see Evan Jones. He lived 1788, 1772. He was a Baptist missionary who translated the Bible into Cherokee. He opposed Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy and slavery, and in solidarity with the Cherokees, he walked the Trail of Tears with them during their forcible relocation from North Carolina to the then destructive area of Oklahoma. Summary. Christian groups, including Puritans, Catholics, Presbyterians, Methodists, Anglicans, and Baptists, sent missionaries to the Americas to convert the indigenous people, whether or not they believed in the lost tribes theory. Upon review, it seems that the missionaries whose primary missionization effort was translating the New Testament or other parts of the Bible into the languages of these indigenous people, these kinds of missionaries were more aligned with Christian principles, so that they often held the people they missionized in high regard and treated them with kindness and respect. Other missionary efforts that use intimidation and force to create converts seem to have missed the entire concept of New Testament Christianity. The Bible Bard has not seen in the text of the Bible any occasion or reference permitting the forced conversion of anyone to the Bible's view of God or humanity. I've read it cover to cover, every word, over now 70 times. I have not seen it. However, it is true that various denominations of Christianity have, like Islam, used force to create converts to their religion. The history of the missionization of indigenous peoples in the New World is an illustration of what happens when people ignorant of the Bible's teaching use religion to justify the oppression of subject peoples. The Bible makes the following pronouncements about missionization. It says in Matthew 28:18, quote, "Then Jesus came to them and said, quote, 'All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations.'" In Mark 10:15, Jesus is speaking and he says, quote, "He said unto them, Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." And in Luke, I think this is 24:46, Jesus speaks and says, he told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem." Finally, in Acts 1:8, he says to his followers, quote, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria." This is still just the Middle East. And he adds, "to the ends of the earth." Making disciples, preaching, and witnessing to one's own biblical faith are not violent acts. Only people who do not know what the Bible teaches about who is God can think to use biblical text to justify the forcible conversion of anyone to any religion. The whole idea of the New Testament missionization is explaining to anyone willing to listen who is God, and encourage them to place their personal faith in the God of the Bible and the person of Jesus Christ. The New Testament example of missionization does not have a missionary beating people to make them accept a message or an authority. The true gospel is never preached under the threat of guns and bayonets. Witnesses only explain what they personally have experienced in their faith. They cannot compel others to have the same experience. And this is what the Bible teaches about missionization. What is it about Christian missionization then that so offends some people? Some may associate Christian missionization with the historical instances of coercion, colonialism, or cultural imposition that I've already discussed in this podcast, and these are errors. Another possibility is that hearing the Christian message makes people feel as though their current religion or worldview is under attack. The suggestion that one is lacking something, especially in a spiritual sense, may be perceived as condescending or intrusive by the offended listener. True Christian missionization is an act of sharing information. So objections to a Christian person sharing, witnessing, preaching, or making disciples do not arise from the act itself when done as the New Testament states, but stem from an objector's own personal or historical grievances. If a true Christian testimony bothers you, the problem is in you, not in the message. Conclusion. This is the way the Bible Bard works. The brief recitations are closely focused. No distractions, no rabbit trails. The Bible Bard presents what the Bible teaches about a topic. I'm not trying to convert you to a religion. The Bible Bard podcast is informational. We're talking about what the literature of the Bible actually states, the ideas and concepts it presents, because most people have never engaged with biblical thought. Make up your own mind whether you agree or disagree with the Bible's pronouncements, and support the Bible Bard if you're with us on Patreon. As little as $1 a week or $5 a month helps to cover the costs of the podcast. You can also give it GoFundMe or go to the website, www.biblebard.org, click the Donate tab, and make a contribution. Send the Bible Bard any questions or remarks you care to offer to BibleBardUS@gmail.com. We're glad to hear from you. And you know how this works. Thanks in advance for following the podcast, sharing the Bible Bard content on the platforms with others. And remember, the Bible Bard English version is translated into other languages, including Spanish, Hindi, Nepali, Urdu, Swahili, Chigua, and Bengali. That's in transcript only. And we're looking for others who speak English as a second language and would help us translate and record the Bible Bard in a local language so we can have podcasts that speak to that language group. Until next time, this is the Bible Bard.